And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. Great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. Great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they want to understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. Great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program, bringing you engaging, intelligent talk, sang style, and doing our level best to make sense out of nonsense, just as the great Biff Gore sings in our original Jimmy at the Crossroads theme song, which, by the way, you can purchase for yourself online at shop.jimmyatthecrossroads.com. Such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you here once again. And I want to encourage you to please, if you have not done so already, subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/JimmyAtTheCrossroads. Like me on Facebook, the page, Jimmy Sengenberger, media personality, facebook.com/Jimmy Sengenberger Pro, and follow us on Twitter at Sang Center. That's Sang with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter. Plus, I alluded to the website JimmyAtTheCrossroads.com, where you can log on to the official shop. There's a tab at the top in the menu. And same thing goes for the Crossroads Club, Jimmy at the Crossroads, Jimmy's Crossroads Club. You can also go to members.jimmyatthecrossroads.com to join there as well. Plus, please be sure to like, follow, subscribe, all those good things to our friends at the Washington Examiner, our partners here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and of course at WashingtonExaminer.com. So today we've got another great best of edition of the program because we've been doing so many exciting things here on the show. Today, we're going to share with you an excerpt from a recent interview I did with Gordon Chang, noted China expert on China and their role in the origination of the coronavirus and not warning the world about it and related issues. Plus, Walter E. Williams, Dr. Walter E. Williams, John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University, joined me recently on a Free to Choose Friday to talk about race and economics, how much can be blamed on discrimination, especially zeroing in on poverty. Also today, from another Free to Choose Friday special episode, we're going to share an excerpt of my conversation with Lindsey Burke of the Heritage Foundation and Corey DeAngelis of the Reason Foundation about school choice. And finally, Nihal Krishan stopped by from the Washington Examiner. We talked about a bipartisan economic plan in order to get out of the coronavirus malaise. Lots coming up today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, special best of edition of the show. Let's roll the tape. It is so unsettling. We talked about at the top of the show what's happening with China vis-a-vis Hong Kong, and also even just a language change in Taiwan towards Taiwan can make a big difference. Gordon G. Chang is author of the book The Coming Collapse of China, is frequently seen on Fox News, and has written for numerous different outlets about China, North Korea, and other related issues. And he rejoins us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Gordon, my friend, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jimmy.
So, Gordon, let's talk a little bit about the tools in the toolbox for the United States. I mean, I know you and I have differed over the China trade war. We're still at an average of 19.3% tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States, which is about 8 times where it was at the start of the trade war in 2018. And so I think from a financial standpoint, in the middle of this economic malaise that some are saying could become a very deep, long-running recession, we certainly don't know how quickly a lot of states will allow a lot of aspects of the economy to reopen and people will get back to work and so forth. So it seems that we can't really go the financial economic route now, given the position that we are, at least when it comes to adding more tariffs because of the economic impact on people in this country who are already struggling. That's my view. What do you think are some of the tools in the toolbox for the United States to go up against China and what they're doing with Hong Kong, and then also, if necessary, if they start taking some incursions against Taiwan?
Well, I think, Jimmy, one of those tools is to increase tariffs. You know, a lot of critics say the American consumers are paying for the Section 301 tariffs, which are meant to be a remedy, by the way, for the theft of U.S. intellectual property. But, you know, we got to look at what's happening with the renminbi. It's been plunging recently, which means that China is bearing the cost of President Trump's tariffs, which means that we have a lot of room to increase those tariffs. We've got to remember that we have a lot of tools. I mean, we can cut off trade, we can cut off investment dollars going into China, all sorts of things that we need to do. And yeah, this will cost the U.S., but we got to remember that we Americans have got to be realistic. We can't think that we can pursue more, you know, almost a half century of misguided and sometimes disastrous China policies and think we can get out of this without a cost. And we've had this cost. We've had trillions of dollars of economic damage and 98,000 American lives and still counting. So we've got to do something. We've got to remember that our republic is at risk. We have a common enemy. That common enemy is attacking us every day. These attacks are relentless, and we've got to do something about it. And it's unfortunate. Yes, there will be costs, but I believe that we should be doing everything we can to reduce our exposure to China. China is not reformable, or at least communist China is not reformable. That means we've got to reduce our exposure to it, which means cutting off trade, cutting off investment, and doing the most we can possibly do to insulate ourselves from a dangerous, militant society.
I think it's a little more complex because of the economic dynamics we're facing now in terms of the challenges, not just of moving supply chains around the globe. That was already something people were looking at with regards to the China trade war. But now we're facing a situation where the economic strife Americans we got 38 million Americans who are now out of work, and they can barely even afford regular products, let alone if we were to try to speed up the movement to other countries. And so I just don't see how that's practical, Gordon, to make that economic switch and force the American people to go through more of an economic strain. Because while China's doing its level best to eat as much of these tariff costs as they possibly can, that doesn't mean that it's working 100%, that we're not seeing economic impacts on the American people, and also that the Chinese government is going to be able to necessarily continue that currency policy that you were pointing to before.
Well, you know, Americans are out of work, so why not bring the factories back into the United States? Why can't we have more of a self-sufficient economy?
Easier said than done, too.
And indeed, we need to do this. And yeah, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I'm saying, Jimmy, that today we have 98,000 American dead, and we're going to have much more. So we've got to understand the severity of the challenge we faced, because that was the result of a deliberate act. And so why should we enrich a regime that has killed tens of thousands of Americans? Yeah, it's going to be hard, but we Americans can do hard things. And we've got to defend our republic, because right now, this is an existential crisis. We are at risk.
Well, I will say this, that I have been, up to the last few months, someone who says we should get rid of those tariffs that we added onto China. I'm not on board with that view at this point right now, because I think of the message that would send to the Chinese, hey, we're not going to have the tariffs in place anymore. Go ahead and just keep doing what you're doing. I don't think that tariff escalation is the way to go, but I also don't think that it's time to do what I was wanting to do, say, the end of 2019 and start paring back those tariffs. But I do want to ask you about a multilateral approach. I appreciate it. I know we're going over time, so final question for you. Bringing the rest of the world to the table and getting them involved in taking action on a united front against China this time, as opposed to the unilateral tariffs that were put into place previously, because all sorts of countries are being impacted by what China did in terms of the coronavirus. What about that?
I couldn't agree with you more. Because China, by the way, is attacking not just the United States, it's attacked everybody else. This is the first time in history, by the way, that one country has attacked all the others. And we need to do more than the Trump administration is doing to build those coalitions, because this is, as I mentioned, that existential fight. So, yeah, I think that we should be not considering, the tariffs on Europe and the rest of it. That I certainly agree with you. We need to have friends. We need to act together. This is one of those situations where we have, as Americans, done that, where we have built those alliances, coalitions, and then met and defeated great enemies. This is one of those times. Couldn't agree with you more.
Although the challenge, to the point that we're both raising here about multilateral, is that a lot of these countries are not trying to stand up to the World Health Organization. They're still saying, hey, you guys are all well and good.
Yeah, well, but we saw, though, at the World Health Assembly last week that 144 countries did sign on to a much tougher proposal than Beijing was willing to accept. I think that clearly there is, as we see week by week, there is more and more concern around the world about China. There's more appetite to doing something effective. And so events are moving our way. And it's up to us as Americans to build upon that and build those coalitions, because clearly sentiment is moving in our way. Whatever was once thought to be impossible is now becoming inevitable. And so we're moving in the right direction in that. And so we can do a lot.
Dr. Walter E. Williams is the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He also is notably someone who filled in for Rush Limbaugh many, many times over the years. In fact, when I was in high school, I learned and got my first doses of free market economics talking with, well, not really talking with, but hearing Dr. Williams talk with us, listeners of the Rush Limbaugh Show, about free market economics. And I'm so pleased to welcome the author of Race and Economics, How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination, Professor Walter E. Williams, to Jimmy at the Crossroads on this Free to Choose Friday. Dr. Williams, can you hear me okay? Welcome to the show.
Yes, I can, and thanks for inviting me.
Let's just go a little bit broader. We zeroed in on one policy, for example, minimum wage. But when you pose a question, how much can be blamed on discrimination in your book, Race and Economics, what's sort of your summation of that? How much can really be blamed on discrimination versus capitalism versus poor government policies like the minimum wage, for example, or lack of educational choice or government welfare programs?
Well, in today's America, very little can be blamed on discrimination, which is not the same as saying discrimination does not exist, but very little can be explained on it by discrimination. For example, the devastating illegitimacy rate among blacks. That's a devastating phenomena, but you cannot blame it on discrimination. Or if you look at the crime in black neighborhoods, where let's say in the case of Chicago, a person is shot every 3.5 hours and murdered every 17 or 18 hours. Well, and most often the victims are black, and it's not the Ku Klux Klan riding through the neighborhood doing that. If you look at the education in some schools, in many schools, where that are predominantly black, the student body is predominantly black, the academic achievement is low. For example, in Baltimore, in the city of Baltimore, in 13 in 13 high schools, not a single student tests proficient in math, and only 5% tests proficient in reading. And Baltimore, its school system is the third highest spending jurisdiction in the country. They spend more per pupil than most other jurisdictions. So these cases that I mentioned, I'm sorry, they have nothing to do with discrimination.
I think it's so profound to think about that, and then also to think about the policies of the government that can be disincentives to work, that can be disincentives to hire, make it impossible sometimes to hire people, as we were talking about with regards to the minimum wage. It goes to the point that fundamentally the problem more than anything is government. Not the solution to the problem, Dr. Williams, but government is fundamentally the problem, is it not?
You're absolutely right.
Somebody should make a statement like that. Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. I don't know. Might make headlines, and people might be saying that for years to come. I just think it might be a good idea. So, Dr. Williams, let me ask you a question. We've just got a few minutes left here. Mark Cuban was on the show yesterday, and we had a spirited debate about his idea for a federal jobs program. One of the themes we've been talking about today with you and with our previous guests from the American Enterprise Institute is the important role that work plays in lifting people out of poverty. So someone might say that an idea like what Cuban is suggesting, which is hire 2 to 4 million people, kind of like what FDR did in the 1930s, to grease the skids of this economy, get things going again, that will also help lift people out of poverty because you're giving them jobs, you're giving them meaning and purpose in life. What about a government jobs program as opposed to, say, a welfare program, not just for the current pandemic, but also in general?
Well, I wouldn't even have a government jobs program. That is, what we need to do is for get government out of our lives.
Exactly. But
many more jobs.
Well, sure. But I'm curious your thoughts on the idea of a government jobs program. What would you contend is why we should not do something like that?
Well, we had it during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it did not do very much. Matter of fact, President Roosevelt's Secretary-Treasurer, Henry Morgenthau, he said in 1939, Mr. President, we spent more money than we've ever spent, and all we got to show for it is debt and no improvement in the economy.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? That you spend all this money and then there's this revelation, hey, this didn't actually work. So, Dr. Williams, go ahead.
Well, see, the very point is you have to ask the question, where does the government get the money from? I mean, is it the Tooth Fairy or the Santa Claus giving them the money? No. The only way the government can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate it from some other American. So if there's a government jobs program, yes, you'll see more people working at government jobs, but you have to say, well, what about over here? That is, a person's taxes have been increased in order for the government to have this program. And what happens to the number of jobs that would have been created if he hadn't been taxed in order to pay for the government jobs?
Hey, this is Frankie.
Hey, and I'm Angelo. We're the owners of F&A Pizzeria. If you're looking for the best pizza in town, remember us, F&A.
Hey, we got the best crust.
F&A.
We got the best cheese.
F&A.
We got the best sauce.
F&A, man.
Put it all together, what do you got?
F&A.
Yeah, you got that right. F&A.
F&A Pizza on the corner of Hill Ya Avenue and Dam Straight Street.
Fake cartoons. I'm gonna do the jumble. Who is it? What do you want?
It's me, Don Trump, Sir Elton John. I'm here to ask you a favor.
Oh my gosh, it's Captain Fantastic himself. So much glitter, so many sparkles, so bedazzled.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, I think. When referencing people in your speeches, could you please refrain from using my song titles?
Oh, you mean like when I called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man?
Yes, exactly like that.
Okay,
Yes,
from now on, he's Madman Across the Water. How would you like?
Well, you see, I have a problem with that because
How
it's the
about
same
if I
derogatory...
call Tulsi Gabbard the Island Girl?
I know, Tulsi, and I don't think she
Ben
would
Carson. Ben Carson is Honky Cat. That's all.
You can't call Ben Carson honky cat. That would be racist.
Why?
Ben Carson's black.
You know, I never noticed he was black at all. I never noticed that. It's funny that somebody like you, Elton John, would point that out to me.
Well, I don't...
All right, fine. From now on, he's Benny and the Jets.
Well, I suppose that's...
Benny and the Jets.
Yes, when Nancy Pelosi inevitably decides to have another round of impeachment, could you please refrain from saying the bitch is back?
It doesn't matter what she says. I'm still standing.
I suppose I'm just going to have to live with that. Fine. If you don't want to help, I'm out of here.
Go on, get out. Hit the yellow brick road so fast and hard. Get out.
Oh, and one more thing, Don Trump. The lyric goes, hold me closer, tiny dancer, not hold me close with tiny hands, sir. Thank you.
Go on, get him out of here. Get him out of here. Let's see. Rhymes with impeachment.
To Obamacare.
Pardon me.
Pardon. Oh, hey, you must be Freddie Mae.
Frederick, please.
Yeah, whatever. Hey, listen, I'm Bill O'Goods with OSLAP. That's Obama's Student Loan Acceleration Program, and we just passed Obamacare, right? We're about to pass another bill to nationalize student loans. It's going to be a whole federal takeover.
Excuse me, sir. Could I get you a drink?
Yes, do you have a Lady Gaga?
Of course. One moment, please. How does this benefit SCALP, the Society of College Academics for Loan Proliferation?
Well, I'm glad you asked. More loans equals more money. That's more money for everybody. You could raise your tuition excrementally in perpetuity forever, and there's nothing they can do about it. You still got to go to school, right? You still got to get a loan. You ain't got no money. It's a win-win. Oh, and here's another thing. You can't discharge student debt by bankruptcy. You could have 3 student loans. You could go you can't declare bankruptcy on any of them. I don't care how much money you don't got.
But what about the students?
The who?
This.
Remember, my friend, here at OSLAP, we make money the old-fashioned way. We steal it from the students. This is for you.
So what you're saying is, this is a gold mine.
Indeed it is.
A gold mine.
A gold mine.
Stop! Let me tell you what's really going on with student loan debt today. You see, in 2010, President Barack Obama nationalized the student loan system, tying it to Obamacare. At that point in time, student loan debt across the country totaled $800 billion. Now, about a decade later, that number has doubled to $1.6 trillion. This is particularly because the federal government keeps giving out the loans, which has allowed colleges and universities to blithely increase their tuition without any concern. And the federal government just keeps giving out the loans because guess what? If your borrower is deeply indebted with student loan debt, you cannot discharge that debt in bankruptcy. You're stuck with it for life. That needs to change, particularly because there's no risk to the lender. That means the federal government can keep giving out loans, and also there's no risk to the colleges and universities, so they'll just keep raising tuition regardless. There really does need to be a congressional action done to address this student loan crisis in America. And at the Millennial Policy Center, we have some great extensive research on how to do this, including some bills working their way through Congress. So log on to millennialpolicycenter.org today to learn more.
Right on.
Well, it's going to be a pretty good decade. Freddie, let's have another drink.
Oh, let me just...
We are zeroing in today on school choice and the virtues of providing parents with the opportunity to choose the best educational institution for their children. Or maybe it's a homeschool opportunity and they'd rather do it themselves. That's what school choice is about, is making sure that parents have the greatest opportunity, the greatest choice for themselves and their children. Let's dive in to this very topic today with two leading scholars on the issue of educational freedom and school choice. Lindsey Burke is the director of the Center for Education Policy and Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. And Corey DeAngelis is director of the School Choice at the Reason Foundation. In addition, Lindsey is a fellow at EdChoice, which was an organization founded by the Friedmans. And also Corey DeAngelis is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Welcome to the show to you both. Thanks so much for joining us, and happy Free to Choose Friday.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And I want to play a clip of the great late Milton Friedman responding to a criticism. This is back in 1980 from his Free to Choose series in Cut 5. This is Milton Friedman responding to some of the criticisms leveled against school choice from a liberal that was on that very program.
The finest schools that you saw in that film were schools that deliberately kept out the most difficult students. Of course you can have a wonderful school if you pick students who are whose parents whose parents are so highly motivated that they're willing to spend more money and willing to go out of their way to do something like that. Now, the public schools have to take the handicap, must provide bilingual education, must engage in busing or other programs in terms of integration, must do all of these things, whereas the private school can come along and say, well, if your child has no problems, you know what we can do? We can offer you a school where you don't have to sit next to a child with these other problems. We're going to put you next to other children who are advantaged.
I think in the real world there is no competition between private schools and public schools, because private schools, especially parochial schools, do not have to comply with federal and state mandates and constitutional limitations and things of that sort.
Dr. Andrig. I think the role of public education in a democracy is not akin to that of the marketplace. The purpose for the common school is not the same as the purpose for the marketplace. We are trying in our public schools to create a democracy, to create an educated electorate. If you're going to do that, you have to have the common school.
Okay, I forgot that actually I wanted to have these liberals in 1980 to whom Milton Friedman responded, shown on the screen so that you could both respond to them. Lindsey Burke, you first. Go ahead. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I will never respond as whatever Milton Friedman himself had responded as well as he would have responded, but I will give it a shot.
None of us could.
To invoke, what Friedman said, right? And when he wrote his original 1955 essay on the role of government in education, this was where he first really articulated the idea of school choice, of vouchers specifically. And he said, separate the financing of education from the delivery of services, that public education does not require government administration of schooling. And he made that point really forcefully, but it did remain an academic idea for a long time. But now we have seen over the past few decades it work in practice, and everything that you just heard from those folks, the progressives, I guess, at the time in that 1980 film, is completely inaccurate. And I would say the number one reason that is inaccurate is because families are selecting into these options. No one is forcing a family to attend a private school that they do not want to attend. The same cannot be said for our government assignment model of schooling, where we relegate a child to a government-run school based on where their family can afford to buy a home, regardless of whether or not that school is the right fit. And so Friedman would have said, we're breaking housing apart from schooling, and we're actually putting power back in the hands of families to determine for themselves and for their child if a given private school is the right fit, and giving them the financial tools by simply allowing dollars to follow them, to pay for that private school tuition. And I'll let Corey weigh in as well. But this idea, one of the gentlemen in that clip said, well, public schools try to infuse democracy and civic values. Well, the operative word there is try, because we know from all of the empirical data that public schools too often are failing on so many important metrics like reading achievement, right? Only a third of students across the country can read proficiently. Fewer than that can do civics and mathematics proficiently. Only 1/3 of Americans across the country today can name a single branch of government. So the onus should be on the government system to say why they should remain entitled to families' dollars rather than giving families a choice to select into other options.
Corey DeAngelis, please do add on to what Lindsey said, but also when we look at what these gentlemen were saying in the video from 1980, 40 years ago, the arguments were very similar to a lot of the counter-arguments we see to educational choice in the year 2020.
Yeah, educational choice opponents often compare private schooling and school choice to perfection, something that we don't have, which Lindsey very correctly pointed out. The nation's latest report card came out just a couple of weeks ago in civics and geography and U.S. history. Only 15% of kids in the U.S. were proficient in U.S. history, and 3 out of every 4 children were not proficient in civics or geography either. So we don't have this well-educated, democratic populace that they're imagining that we have. But then also school choice benefits the least advantaged more than anyone else. Rich people already have school choice. Rich people can afford to live near the best public schools, and they can already afford to pay out of pocket for private schools. So school choice programs in the form of a voucher and education savings account disproportionately benefits the least advantaged more than anyone else because their kids are stuck in the worst government schools right now, and they're the least likely to be able to afford to pay for private school tuition out of pocket. So in that sense, school choice is an equalizer. And in practice, if you look at these programs, overwhelmingly, they're targeted to the least advantaged based on lower income families, students with special needs, and then students who are in lower performing government run schools. So school choice is an equalizer, and anyone trying to claim the opposite is just not looking at the evidence and not contending with the fact that rich people already have school choice.
Lindsey Burke, one thing that strikes me too about those who oppose the idea of providing parents with greater choice for how to best educate their children, one thing that's striking is that they always presume that you automatically oppose public schools, that say you want to defund public schools in order to provide that kind of experience. I'm a big advocate, especially because I don't see government schools going away, a big advocate of providing a good quality public school education as an option for parents to provide for their students, but also making sure that we pay teachers more. We see administrative costs across the country that have just become absolutely bloated as teacher pay has not even just not risen, but in some cases has even gone down in parts of the country, while administration is getting more and more funding headed in its direction. So talk to us a little bit about this idea, this myth that supporting educational choice means that you oppose public schools and basically want to disenfranchise those who are going to public schools.
Right. So this all comes back to what Friedman originally articulated, which was fund the student and then allow those dollars to flow wherever the family chooses. And so we have to redefine how we think about public education. Public education should be an education available to the public, but we can separate that from this idea of government delivery. So yes, as Friedman said, publicly fund the child, but allow those dollars to follow to any school, public, private, charter, whatever it might be. This administrative bloat point is incredibly important. This is something, there is a lot of data now on administrative bloat. If you go all the way back to 1950, prior to the Great Society, Johnson's Great Society, when we saw massive government intervention in education, there were about 2.36 teachers for every non-teacher in a school district across the country. Fast forward to today, that number is 1 to 1. So that means on average in a district, for every teacher you see walking around, there is a non-teaching administrative counterpart. And that's been a huge strain on state budgets. I'll just say quickly, why have we seen what some would argue is maybe mismanagement or at least not good prioritization of spending in districts? It's because they don't have to worry as much about that prioritization. When Friedman wrote that Role of Government in Education essay, he outlined that there are basically 4 ways that you can spend money. And I love this example because I think it works really well for school choice. So Friedman said, you can spend your own money on yourself, you can spend your own money on somebody else, you can spend somebody else's money on yourself, or you can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. That last category is how public schools spend money. It's just how they're designed. They spend somebody else's money, your taxpayer dollars, on somebody else's children. And so there's very little, if any, incentive to economize or to maximize value. School choice options get us much, much closer to spending your own money on your own children. And so that is why not only do they maximize educational opportunity and outcomes, but they help with that dollar allocation as well.
Again, Lindsey Burke is director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and Corey DeAngelis is director of the School Choice at the Reason Foundation. And Corey, I want to go with you to one particular criticism that I hear about school choice, and that is the idea that you hold different schools from a government standpoint to different standards. So there are particular standards that public schools must meet in order to get certain funding, access to this and that, so they have standardized testing and so forth. But private schools and homeschooling, those things can be treated differently in certain ways. You also have different licensing requirements for teachers at private schools, even charter schools, than traditional public schools. And so some say you shouldn't give funding from the government, from taxpayers, to those kinds of schools because those teachers and those educational institutions are treated differently. To which you say what to that criticism?
You shouldn't give funding to any schools at all. The funding should go to the individual. No, the funding should go to the person, and the person should be able to choose those government schools if the regulations are actually beneficial, and if standardized testing requirements are actually beneficial, then families will continue to choose those government-run schools. My argument is that while those top-down regulations aren't all that beneficial, maybe we should get rid of some of those regulations that are hampering down the government-run schools and instead hold schools accountable from the bottom up like we do in every other industry by allowing people to vote with their feet. And I also want to add, based on the previous point, that, look, school choice is good for teachers too, because it gives individual private, public schools stronger incentives to allocate the money towards the students in the classroom and to raise teacher salaries. If you look at Ben Scafferty's latest report on this, he found that between 1992 and 2014, real inflation-adjusted per-pupil spending in the U.S. has gone up by 27%. Real teacher salaries have actually dropped by 2% in the U.S. Where's all the money going? It's not going to the classroom. And that, I argue, is because the public schools do not have strong incentives to spend the money wisely.
Today, I am pleased to be joined by Nihal Krishan, who is an economic policy reporter at the Washington Examiner, to talk about a few different topics, including some interesting tidbits about President Trump from a former White House economic advisor, and also a bipartisan economic recovery plan. Nihal Krishan, welcome back to the show. It's good to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Jimmy.
Let's shift gears here. We're looking right now at a very difficult, tumultuous economic environment. Still nearly 40 million Americans out of work as a result of both coronavirus and the government lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, essentially shutting down the economy over the past few months. We're just now starting to see people really getting back to work, but it's a slow-moving process. And so there's a big debate going on in Washington, D.C. about how to handle the economic recovery process, what government should or should not do. And some former economic advisors to presidential administrations, for economists in particular, got together to propose their own plan of attack for helping to spur this recovery along. Nihal Krishan, what are you reporting for the Examiner as being proposed by some of these former advisors?
Yeah, so These are former advisors. Jason Furman, who was President Obama's economic advisor, President Bush's former economic advisor, and then Timothy Geithner, who was Obama's Treasury Secretary, and then another professor of economics at the University of Maryland. And they have four essential elements within their proposal to grow the economy and allow us to continue to recover as strongly as possible. And they are income support for the unemployed, pandemic employment benefits for low-wage workers, support for small businesses, and support for state and local governments in terms of fiscal and financial relief. And so these are the four key tenets that they outline in order to help us in the coming months as the most pressing ways to help those, particularly those at the bottom end of the economic spectrum.
So in terms of this plan, they're clearly refuting the argument from some conservatives, myself included, that the government shouldn't be doing some extensive programs. Now, they don't want to do everything. They have, as you said, a handful of key planks to this proposal for what should be done at the federal level. But they do counter the argument that we shouldn't do nothing or that we shouldn't do anything. They say that you do need to take particular steps. Why do they think we still need some fairly substantial government involvement?
So their claims are that if we have no unemployment insurance or benefits and no help for low-wage workers who are not able to earn enough money, then there is going to be even more job losses, that there will be catastrophic damage to the economy, that it'll take longer for the recovery to occur. Basically, they say that, that whatever recovery we've had so far has been propped up substantially and bolstered by the economic spending from the CARES Act and others. And if that doesn't continue, there will be a vacuum and a significant gap that companies and corporations are not going to be able to fill because they're not strong enough to do so yet.
What about the argument that spending from government misallocates resources and can actually slow the recovery? They sort of touch on that in your reporting, although I don't know how far they go in that regard. But what do they say about spending slowing down the recovery as opposed to speeding up, as conservatives would say?
So Jason Furman says unequivocally that there's no evidence whatsoever that greater government spending slows down the recovery or results in less jobs, and furthermore says that their plan takes into account even the possibility that could happen, because the proposals are structured around what they call automatic triggers, and that's an essential part to understand of their plan. And automatic triggers are basically only if the unemployment rate dips beneath a certain point, or let's say economic growth dips beneath a certain point, then that will automatically trigger certain plans of theirs to get into motion, instead of relying upon Congress to keep legislating every time a new issue comes up. Their automatic triggers, if this were to be passed into legislation, would automatically create certain economic actions and initiatives to be put in place.
Something that they refute is the idea put forward by Trump administration officials of reducing the capital gains tax. And they specifically say, no, we shouldn't do this. Now, one of the economists that's party to this plan probably, as one of the, I think it was Jason Furman says, probably would oppose the plan if it were to actually include a increase in the tax on capital gains. That is to say that what has been put forward doesn't include capital gains tax. The three more liberal economists that are part of this would support increasing capital gains taxes if that was the case, at least it seems that way, versus the conservative on the panel who would advocate otherwise. And they specifically note that, okay, that we didn't touch on this, and if we did, there would have been a difference of opinion. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Glenn Hubbard is the conservative, the staunch conservative on their team, amongst their gang of four, and he was President W. Bush's chief economic advisor. And so, he would be absolutely for reducing capital gains tax, unlike Jason Furman, Obama's former economic advisor. And that would have been a source of friction and fighting between them if this was something that they were considering. But Jason's point, Obama's former advisor's point, was that surprisingly, the conservatives and liberals did not have much disagreement, actually, because of the pandemic and the urgency around it. But they said that outside of these immediate 4 actions that they wanted to take, if we're talking about economic policy more broadly, there would probably be many other disagreements.
Yeah, that is interesting, where they managed to narrow it down to 4 areas of commonality. I still think it goes a little bit too far, but I'm not part of this group of 4. Probably I wouldn't want to be a part of the group of 4 if that was the particular plan. But I do think that it's interesting, this capital gains discussion in Washington, D.C., because that is something that the Trump administration is advocating, particularly because they would like to spur more investment. Now, I'm an advocate personally of eliminating the capital gains tax altogether, which isn't a very common position. But nevertheless, what is sort of the discussion just finally, Nihal Krishan, going on in D.C. about reducing the capital gains tax? Is that something that could actually go anywhere? It doesn't seem so, especially with Democrats in control of the House of Representatives.
There certainly is a huge wellspring of support for this in the Senate and the House from Republicans. Mm-hmm. I think this has been an issue that they have pushed for and championed for a number of years, and the White House is very much backing it as well. But in terms of it realistically becoming law, no, I would say that there's very little chance of that, as you said, with the Democrats controlling the House and being opposed to it. As this is an issue which they see is related to inequality, and that capital gains tax would primarily benefit the rich and the wealthy. And so, why would we pass something that would help them when there's lots of people in the middle class or lower class who are suffering? And there's some truth to that argument, that it would primarily help those who are wealthier, who have capital gains in the first place. Whereas Republicans say that this is something that could help spur economic growth, and that people having money themselves, even if it's people who are a little wealthier, is to the macroeconomy's benefit.
Well, especially because if you reduce capital gains, this is the argument, which I espouse along with those particular conservatives. The argument is that if you reduce the capital gains tax rate, then you encourage additional investment, because the wealthier people are not just hiding their money under a mattress. They're going to put it to work in investing in various private sector enterprises, which then benefits the overall economy because it can help create jobs and produce better, more innovative products that make people's lives better, so on and so forth. So it will be interesting to see if this can at least gain traction in terms of the media discussion and the discussion among average everyday Americans in terms of economic policies, because it's not something that is getting too much attention, certainly from an in-depth standpoint. But Nihal,
who knows? Maybe,
go ahead,
President Trump will maybe President Trump will employ one of his strategic exaggerations when it comes to capital gains tax and make it out to be something a little different or bigger than it is, and people will find out about it.
How about President Trump tweets out, "I want to eliminate the capital gains tax altogether"? Maybe that would do it. What do you think?
It could. I hope he hears this on your show first.
I hope so too. That is brilliant input, Nihal, to really encapsulate everything that we have been discussing in our segment today. Well, that is it for today's edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, featuring some of our best of content. We've got so much more coming up here on the show. Have a great day. Thank you so much for being a part of the program. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel for Jimmy at the Crossroads, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. Check it out. Don't miss a beat. My thanks to you for joining us, to producer extraordinaire Nathan Matoush, working the Matoush magic. We'll be back and see you next time. For now, I'm Jimmy Sangenberger. Oh, and thanks to the Washington Examiner, our great partners here on the show. God bless America.